各位来宾，会议即将开始，请尽速就座，并请将您的手机调为静音或震动。谢谢您的合作。Ladies and gentlemen, the conference is about to begin at 9 a.m. Please take your seat and remember to turn off your cell phone. Thank you for your cooperation. 因应新型冠状病毒疫情，且配合政府防疫政策，进入室内场所需佩戴口罩。Please wear the face mask in response to the outbreak of the new coronavirus. 各位来宾早安。2021年遇见教育2030风险时代的教育价值反思与行动国际研讨会大会开始。Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to International Conference on Envisioning Education 2030. Educational Value, Reflection, and Action in the Era of Risk. 请开幕贵宾上主席台就座。First of all, I would like to invite the guests of honor to take the reserved seat on the stage. 请大会主席、国立台湾师范大学教育学系方永全方主任致辞。Let's welcome the chairperson of conference, Dr. Fang Yongquan, to give us the welcome remarks. Dr. Fang is also the chairman of Education Department, National Taiwan Normal University. Let's welcome him.
谢谢。好，我们黄董事长、刘教务长、吴理事长、严副院长，还有陈院长， 还有我们在座的毛副院长、周老师，还有我们曾老师啊，我们线上所有的师长啊，我们所有的先进伙伴，大家早安。好，那我想非常欢迎各位今天来参加我们的遇见2030遇见教育2030风险时代的教育价值反思与行动，以及2021年亚太师资教育学会年会今天我们是联合来举办那我想这一次的会议在疫情期间因为是在疫情的期间，所以我们不得已用线上的形式来举办那因为它是一个线上举办的形式其实也是我们教育系所举办的类似的研讨会当中第一次用这样的形式来进行举办所以我想在会议的一开始，还是要先跟各位来介绍一下我们今天所有的与会的贵宾。那首先要跟各位介绍的是，我们以主办的学校的地主代表的身份来参加我们研讨会的刘美惠教务长，谢谢。然后再来是我们财团法人黄坤辉教授教育基金会黄坤辉董事长，好，谢谢。我们接下来是我们中国教育学会吴五典理事长，再来是我们国家教育研究院的严庆祥严副院长。好，那最后也是我们身兼这一次亚太师资教育学会年会的主办人，我们最喜爱的教育学院的陈学志陈院长。OK， 好，谢谢各位贵宾今天能够来莅临。那这一次的这个研讨会的举办真的因为疫情的关系啦所以在整个的疫情未明的一个状况底下来说，其实筹办的过程当中其实所有的工作人员都非常的辛苦，我们在这边也一并的致谢那这一次的主办其实包含了是除了我们台师大教育系所之外那另外在这整个的过程当中，我们黄坤辉老师教育基金会，那另外教育部科技部，还有我们台湾师大以及台湾师大教育学院，还有中国教育学会还有国家教育研究院，都给我们全力的一些协助跟赞助。那此外也包含了说我们这个台湾教育大学的系统，以及国内的各大学的教育学院，还有教育的各专业学会的一同的支持来协办，所以才成就这一次盛会我想我个人真的是致上非常高的谢意疫情的关系啦，所以我们这一次其实在筹办的过程当中来说的话，其实里面充满了很多的不可测的因素所以对我们这个所有的工作人员来说，其实我们的心情就有点像是这个遇见2030风险时代那种感觉一样。那谈到这个遇见，就让我想起教育学者杜威，他也在讲预测。他讲所谓的预测，就是我们在做任何的这样子的一个行动之前，都必须要对许多的结果，我们要做出一些预测。但这预测除了要有事实的根据之外，也必须要有一些想象力，也必须要有一些洞见。那我想，想象力加上洞见加上预测，其实就形成了我们所讲的一个预见预见。那我想真的在一个风险的时代里面，其实教育作为一个工程，关于未来的工程，关于未来的一项事业，甚至是志业，其实都需要所有的教育工作者具备更厚实的研究力、跟洞察力和想象力那这一次大会的举办，也要非常感谢所有的论文的发表者、主持人，还有就是各场次的引言人，因为你们无私的把教育的智慧能够奉献出来，才成就了这一场知识的盛宴Finally, a special thanks to all the keynote speakers, Dean Goodwin, Professor Lingard, Professor Vickers, and Professor Chen Dehua for bringing us wonderful lectures. And thanks to all the distinguished guests who take part in the 2021 conference of the Asia Pacific Association for Teacher Education. Thank you for your participation. Your participation not only witness the glorious image of future education, but also symbolize a core spirit of education, connection. It is the love for education and the education study that connects us all together. Thank you all. 好，谢谢大家。好，那以下我们是不是能够请我们的教务长来先帮我们致辞，先以主办的地主的身份来致欢迎词，谢谢。
好，我们方主任，我们的董事长，还有院长，还有吴老师，好，还有我们的严副院长，现场的各位师长、同学以及线上的贵宾，大家早安。早。我是台师大的教务长刘美惠。那今天因为校长有其他重要的行程，所以不客前来致辞。就校长非常关心我们的研讨会的举办，那他历年来也都会出席参加哈。那这次他就希望我能够代表学校来跟各位问候，那也就是非常肯定我们母系教育系这几年在每一年都筹办这样的一个国际研讨会。那今年呢，尤其是非常特别的一年哈，就是因为疫情的关系，所以改采这个线上的方式来举办。那我们教育系在这样的一个风险时代、全球化的时代，运用这个数位科技的能力哈，还有这个应变的能力是非常强的。那我们也知道，2030是一个重要的一年了，就是联合国永续发展目标，希望能够在2030年能够达到17项的目标。那这个目标里面有包含社会的、经济的，还有环境的一些挑战。那希望我们成为全球的公民的一份子，都能够朝这样的目标来努力。那在其中的一项目标呢，是有关于教育品质。那我想这个应该也是我们教育界最关心的一个目标之一哦。那教育的品质的提升，希望可以更具包容性，更具公平正义。那我想今天的研讨会回应这样的一个重要的主题是非常有意义的。那我就在这边代表学校，代表我们教育系的一份子，好，祝福大会能够顺利成功，谢谢大家。
好，我们非常谢谢教务长给我们的致辞。那我们接下来是不是就请黄坤辉老师、黄坤辉董事长来帮我们说几句话？谢谢。老师可以坐着讲，没关系。
大会主席方主任，还有陈院长，我们台师大刘教务长中国教育协会吴理事长，还有国教院的严副院长各位贵宾，各位与会的学者、专家，各位教育界的好伙伴，大家早，大家早 ，Good morning， 大家早。今天师大教育学系举办2021年国际学术研讨会，那么亚太师资教育学会在这里联合举行这个年会，黄坤辉教授教育基金会忝为这个合办者之一，觉得无上的这个光荣。今天大会的主题刚刚主席还有刘校长都已经提得非常清楚。这预见教育2030这风险时代的教育价值反思与行动，我觉得非常之有意义，也非常适合我们今天的教育的这个需求。我们常讲教育的目的是在培养人才、培育人才。优质的教育不但是要使个人的这个是潜能获得最大的发展，而且他所培养的人才要为社会所需，能够适应这个快速变迁的社会， 能够因应风险的年代，那么促进社会的一个发展。我们今天呢是处于一个不确定的这个年代，也可以说是充满着一个风险的一个年代。那么我们这个这现在的这种 COVID 这个疫情冲击人类的生活生命也改变了我们的教育的这个方式。像数位化不但是改变了这个是工作的形态、用人的需求，同时也改变了我们这个学习的方式。像是民主化不但是促成了社会制度的转型，而且呢，也这个使得教育内容要因应这个多元民主素养的这种需求。全球化也生了激烈的国际竞争，凡此等等，我们的新时代就处于这样一个变动不居的一个时代，是处于这样一个风险的这个年代。那么，而且我们检讨我们自己国家的教育，老实讲我觉得我们也存在一些相当也可以说是严重的问题，那就是这个社会阶层的再制这个顶大无寒门这个是师大多弱势，这个 M 型的社会形成这样的一个教育的一个发展是我们不愿意见的。像是培育人才失衡，这个社会所需的人才跟学校所培养的人才可以说是没有能够对准，而且学用落差那么拉大，凡此等等，都是我们在这个风险时代应该要检讨的。那么刚刚刘校长也提到这个未来这个10年是一个关键的10年，2030年都作为这个指标年。我们的主题是2030预见2030这个教育，所以像这个联合 UNESCO 迈向2030，这个是这个教育的一个新愿景。那 OECD 有一个 OECD Learning Compass， 那么这个学习的罗盘，像我们行政院的国发会提出这个双语教育的一个新的一个蓝图，教育部也发表中小学教育的国际白皮书，凡此等等，都是以2030作为指标年。我今天早上看到报纸上报道，教育部要投资，这个是这个200亿多少钱，要给每一个中小学学生都有这个平板利用平板的机会，就代表一个学习的适应。所以我觉得，虽然是未来充满的风险，但是也充满了契机所以我们年轻人，我们的新世代，大家要把握这个机会，因为政府将会投入更多的一个资源在这10年教育当中，所以要更能力。那么这一次的研讨会一定会提出一个很好的这种因应的对策来供教育行政这个主管机关参考，让他们采取更有作为的一种这个措施。那么我们学子更努力发展自己的长才，然后在这个2030年我们可以有更好的教育，我们青年人有更这个璀璨的前景。那么以上这个是粗浅的意见仅供大家参考。最后祝大会圆满成功，谢谢。
好，我们非常谢谢黄董事长给我们的勉励我们以下是不是再请我们中国教育学会的吴典理事长吴典老师来帮我们说几句话？谢谢。
大会主席黄主任啊，贵宾各位贵宾，特别是黄国立教授基金会的黄董事长啊，那么我就不一一点名了啊。那么还有线上线下的各位教育界的伙伴，大家好。我代表主办单位之一啊，有90年历史的中国教育协会啊，特别强调90年，因为海峡对岸有一个44岁的中国教育协会，那么来这个欢迎大家啊，同时也表示感谢。今天是一个教育界的大日子，1年1度的国际学术研讨会啊，结合教育学术团体联合联会，隆重在台湾师大来展开。那么欢迎大家来共同参与。除了共同参与，这个不容易，因为今年疫情特别，这非常时期，大家的参与特别值得珍贵啊！感谢大家，同时也感谢很多支持的单位、赞助的单位啊。那么像这个黄国立教授基金会出钱出力，国家教育学院也出钱出力，更不要说台湾师大了啊！以这个教育系这黄主任的领导的团队呢，来参与这个筹备，已经很多年了，每一次都很盛大，但是都圆满的来达成任务，实在是非常的不简单。我知道这一次的节目非常的充实啊，有专题演讲，有专题论坛，有论文发表，还特别安排了青年论文的发表，很多的青年学者年轻的学者他们也都参与提供他们的论文，这是非常非常难得的另外2个学会可能大家比较陌生，一个亚太师资教育学会是主办单位之一再一个就是台湾教育学术联盟，那么他们也都参与了。其中台湾学术教育联盟的一个偏乡教育的分组呢，在这个会上呢要正式成立。那么这2个会呢，都是教育学的院长陈水志陈院长呢，他来这个主持的。所以这次的会不但有一些延续过去的，更有一些创新的东西。相信大家参与之后，一定感到很有收获如果有不满意的地方请大家多多指教。不过应该是教育系的，教育系的。那么感谢但是也很谦虚的来欢迎大家来参与，因为我是教育系的这个系友这个之一相信大家会满意的那么满载而归，这是我们的期待。相聚不容易，尤其在疫情当下真的是很不容易我们希望大会成功，希望大家收获满满，谢谢。
我们的期许突然觉得这个肩上这个担子其实还蛮重的但是刚刚吴理事长也提到我们这次的大会其实除了我们亚太的师资教育学会的年会之外，那另外也包括说我们那个明天早上有一个中华民国教育学术团体联合年会也会举办。那此外，好像我们学校这个高教深耕的办公室也同时在这个时间也跟我们一起合办了偏乡教育论坛。好，所以整个活动其实是真的是非常非常的丰富谢谢吴理事长给我们的一些提点。那我们接下来是不是再有请我们这个国家教育研究院的严副院长再帮我们说几句话？谢谢。
谢谢。谢谢主席，还有在座的我的师长，还有嘉宾大家好。每次来参加这样的一个大会，一个研讨会，我是收获很多的。我事实上是得利最大的从2019我到国家教育研究院，那么到今年我参加连续3年，我都亲自到现场，是因为这边给我很大的养分。以今年的主题来讲，我觉得对我来讲是很大的一个冲击跟提供很多的想象的一个来源比如说意见2030年。我在屏东县当教育处长的时候，我在100年的时候，就2011年的时候做了4件事情。第一个就是让屏东县的小学做一个成果跟参展，主题是什么？就是未来的家乡。所以林边乡的孩子 就因为淹水，所以他们说房子要怎么盖，交通工具要怎么改变，然后呢，他们要如何去上学，这些都改变了他的一个思维。然后第二件事情是无人机，第三件事情是机器人，第四件事情就是实验教育学校的前身叫理念学校。我的意思是，今天这个主题带给我目前工作的冲击是，台湾的课纲不是说10年要修一次，而是说我们课纲的想象跟架构事实上要做调整的。我们现在走的课纲还是属于刚性课纲。那各位知道，一个国家课程对未来人才的培育跟公民的该有的样子，是一个非常重要的一个架构。那国家教育研究院就负责这份主要工作之一。那我们的刚性课纲其实没办法因应这么变动不居的一个未来。比如说，我们这一次的108课纲强调是要能够跟孩子的生活情境做结合。那各位，你想想看，现在的生活情境，你在定课纲的时候，你怎么能想象会有疫情的来临？你完全想象不到。更何况疫情过后呢，就是今天要演讲的主题。但那个各种的变化，不管是政治的、经济的、科技的、环境的、能源的、气候的，都是我们很难想象的。那如何来培养孩子该有的核心能力？不管整个世代怎么变动，整个全球化怎么变动，他都可以能够生存、生活跟展现他生命的自我实现。那这个就是今天这个大会各种的研讨会，还有各种的演讲，可以带给我很大的一个能量，所以我很感恩，也很感谢。所以与其说我是来支持这样的一个研讨会，不如说我是一个最大的受益者。再一次祝福大家都能够平安，让大会成功。谢谢，谢谢。
严复非常感性的这样的一个分享，让我们知道说我们国家的一些未来的一些教育及课程方面的一些图像。我们接下来是不是再有请我们的另外一位我们的大会的主席主办的这个人陈学志院长来帮我们讲几句话？谢谢。
大会主席黄主任，还有黄董事长，还有我们教务长，还有我们吴理事长，还有严副院长，还在座的周院长，还有毛副院长，小安老师，还有曾伟老师，还有各位老师还有在座的各位先进大家早安。那我代表台湾师范大学教育学院，还有我们台湾教育学术联盟，还有亚太师资教育学会来感谢我们有这次机会能够跟中国教育学会来合办这个年度的研讨会那刚那个吴理事长提到说，中国教育学会是90岁了，我们亚太师资教育学会是2岁，对，所以我们是对 baby 所以我们所以应该是带着追随着我们老大哥的脚步，慢慢虎虎前进慢慢茁壮，也希望给我们这个机会。这次我们这次亚太师资教育学会也集合了12个国家，很多个的很精彩的论坛那在这个开始之前，是不是容我先简单的说明一下我们台湾教育学术联盟跟亚太师教育学会的背景那2017年我们为了因应国家的新南向政策那台师大就集合着台大、政大，还有那个台科大，还有清大，还有成大，整6个学校共同组成那个教育学术联盟，向我们的南向的国家做学术的交流。那在我们也以联盟的形式出访菲律宾、越南那个马来西亚跟印尼都得到很大的回响。那在国内我们办了很多的教育沙龙有几个需要一起来共同讨论我们教育未来的方向跟我们学术的合作，那成果都非常的丰硕。那到去年为止，我们这个慢慢的扩大，从最早的只有6个学校参加，现在已经有24个学校的教育学院跟师培的单位加入那我们也办过，每年都办了很多的教育沙龙来探讨，还有相关的研讨会。但是我们在探讨跟我们出访的 状况里面，跟东南亚各个国家交流的时候，我们就发现说，我们有必要有从亚洲的观点跟来谈这些教育的问题，尤其是师培的问题哦。因为我们跟现在主流的欧美的一些教育的观点，我们亚洲应该是有我们自己的关切点跟我们自己的的一些立场哦。比如说我们刚刚提到说，现在最很流行的双语的问题哦，双语东南亚国家都碰到，但是美国不会碰到，他们的问题跟我们不一样哦。对，我刚才讲一个笑话，再讲一次哈，就说那个他说老师问学生说会讲2种语言叫什么？他说是bilingual，会讲3种语言 trilingual， 会讲4种以上语言就是 multilingual。老师说那会讲1种语言叫什么？他是叫 American， 就是因为他不用学这各种语言哦，所以我们会发现说这个问题我们事实上我们有必要我们自己一起来研讨，还有我们会碰到一些我们在东南亚儒家文化圈里面我们会谈到的，比如说考试的问题。那我们是非常重视考试跟升学，所以我们在考试的成绩都很好，但是学生的兴趣跟动机很低落。那这个也是欧美比较不会碰到的问题哦。尤其是那个我们后来很多人都说，大家交流的时候都说，虽然很多人毕业了，但现在晚上做梦，很多做噩梦都梦见自己在考试哦，都很紧张焦虑哦。那这个就会想到说，有2个同学他们碰在一起谈话，甲就对乙说：“我好紧张哦，我昨天梦见我在考试哦，半夜醒过来全身是冷汗。”那乙就要说：“我比你更糟糕，我梦见我在考试哦，但是我醒过来的时候真的在考试。”就是考试到睡着了，所以这个事实上是很可怕。那所以我们后来就在去年成立了亚太师教育学会哦，跟这几个国家，刚开始也没有很多国家，5、6国家参与，像今天我们这次的会议就12个国家来共同探讨，跟我们这次大会主题很有关系的，就是形塑未来教师哦，在这个多变的教育的环境之下，那我们有跨国的论坛。还有我们有新书的发表，还有研究生的论坛。那我们还有一个最重要的是，我们也在台湾教育学术联盟今年成立6个学校共同成立偏乡教育的工作小组。那这次的研讨会，我要感谢我们马副院长的殚精竭力，帮忙我们带领我们工作同仁一起来组织这个议程哦，还有曾伟老师，还有伊犁老师哦，那对我们这个研讨会，我们才能够完成。我想说，刚刚提到说预见未来是很重要的问题哦，因为我们的老师是没有办法用过去的知识教现在学生面对未来的问题，我们一定要有往前思考的一种动机跟一种视野哦，因为但彼得·多拉克说过，就是说预测未来最好的方法就是创造未来。我们不只是追随别人未来，我们应该领先的创造我们自己的未来哦。我们要想象未来，选择未来，最后要创造我们未来，甚至引领国家的未来跟世界未来。希望我们今天大会能够圆满成功。好，谢谢大家。
我们的致辞帮我们把整个大会的这样的一个前因后果它整个的轮廓都做了一个非常详尽的一个说明。那我想限于时间的关系，我们接下来还有3场非常精彩的主题演讲，我们是不是就在这个我们所有的贵宾的这样的一个致辞当中，我们就结束我们的一个开幕式。好，谢谢各位贵宾，谢谢。
第1场主题演讲由国立台湾师范大学曾小兰教授主持，香港大学教育学院院长 Goodwin Allen 主讲，讲题为 Preparing Teachers for Uncertainty， Teacher Education for the 31st Century。因疫情关系，本次主题演讲形式改为影片形式。影片播放完毕后，将会进行线上的即时问答，请与会贵宾多加包涵。The first keynote session will start at once. Our speaker will be Dean Nguyen Arlene from Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. Dean Nguyen Arlene's topic is Preparing Teachers for Uncertainty, Teacher Education for the 31st Century. 接下来将时间交给主持人曾小兰教授。Let's welcome the moderator, Dr. 曾小兰 from National Taiwan Normal University.
Good morning, everyone. Especially particularly my warmest greeting to our guests of honors here and also in the air. Okay, and it's my great honor to chair our first sessions. That I can have the opportunity to introduce my friend, Dr. Lin Nguyen from Hong Kong University, and she is the Dean of the Faculty of Education at Hong Kong University. And actually, I met her the first time when she was invited a visiting scholar in Institute of Education at Singapore. Okay, and I think later then she moved to Hong Kong. Okay, originally actually she was a professor at Teachers College at Columbia University. And right now she is endowed chair professor of education on the Eden Foundations. So she's widely written, and she was selected as the vice president of American Education Association. Okay, and leading Division K, which one is particularly focused on the teaching and teacher educations. And I think we are so happy that, and we are so honored to have him with us to talk about the preparing teacher for uncertainty, teacher education for the 31st century. It's not a typo, okay? But she's so not only envision for the 2030s, but also try to envision and look forward, okay, to the 31st century. So please join me to welcome Dr. Lin Nguyen to give us the speech, wonderful speech, which is on video. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lin Nguyen. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. And it is my pleasure to join you today to talk about education for the future for 2030. Let me just begin by sharing my slides, because my focus today is going to be specifically on the preparation of teachers, preparing teachers for uncertainty. And no, that is not a typo. It is teacher education for the 31st century. So this is not a new conversation. We talk all the time about a VUCA world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We know that things are rapidly changing. And of course, things changed even more so in the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, that revealed all kinds of inequities and digital divides, and created, in some sense, a period also of international social unrest and social movements around issues of justice and equity. But even in the middle of crisis, even in the middle of tragedy, there are many lessons to be learned. And the pandemic actually taught us quite a few important things. First, we learned that we can actually act quickly as an education community. Education is not known for moving quickly, but somehow we managed to do that during the pandemic, and going online with our instruction is just one example. The second is that we've seen very, very clearly, more so than ever before, that the world community is hurting. that there is a great deal of pain, there's a great deal of oppression, there are many people who are suffering. Third, we have seen clearly that AI by itself is not going to replace teachers, that AI, artificial intelligence, needs HI, human intelligence. The two together can do more than we ever imagined. And finally, no matter what we say about how to be future ready, the reality is we are not future ready and we can never be, because the future is simply uncertain. And if anything has been learned in the last 2 years, it is this, that the future surprises us all the time. So clearly, if the world is changing, then teachers and teaching must change with it. And the question is, are we changing? Can we change to the extent that we need to? On the one hand, we have been talking for a long time, pre-COVID, but COVID has just heightened this conversation, that teaching and learning need to be different, that it needs to be active and engaging so that students are participating. It needs to be collaborative so that students are working together, solving problems and sharing knowledge. It certainly needs to focus on diversity because we know students are not the same and have all kinds of different capacities and needs. And finally, that it needs to be creative and imaginative, that it should be full of experimentation, positive failure, and the opportunity to experiment. However, I hesitate to say that we have moved away from teaching as it has been for, unfortunately, a great deal of time. Teaching is telling, where the teacher is always the one talking. Most research tells us that teachers talk more than 80% of the time in the classroom. And when students talk, they are responding to closed-ended questions posed by teachers. We still think of teaching and learning as knowledge, as content, and that our job as educators is to pour that content into an empty mind. And the demonstration of learning is that students, pupils, are able to return to us what we have given them. So we give it to them, they regurgitate it, and then we are satisfied that they have been, that they are successful students and that we have been successful in teaching them. So how do we move away from this notion of a general education that treats all students as if they're the same, even though intellectually we know that they are different? So I would like to offer a few ideas from my own work that I feel are powerful enough to transcend the practicalities, realities, and limitations of politics, culture, implementation, human capital, resource distribution, and local norms. Ideas that can go deep beneath the surface to touch the heart of learning and teaching. What kinds of big ideas could sort of shape and guide our teaching rather than the discrete goals that we have been focused on? I call these 5 knowledge domains for teaching, and talk today a little bit about what they might mean for teachers, not just today or tomorrow, but long into the beyond, perhaps into the 31st century. Let me begin with the first one, which I call personal knowledge. And this personal knowledge is focused on autobiography and one's philosophy of teaching, what you value and believe in as a teacher. The fact is that every person, each one of us who entered into teaching came with a lot of personal knowledge about teachers and the whole act of teaching, because these impressions were already formed from the many years of our being a student. The interesting thing is that even if you don't go into teaching, you still have this vast sort of pool of personal knowledge, because pretty much everyone in most societies, not all, has been to school and has been to several years of school. So teacher preparation should be a transition between the knowledge that one has had and brings into the profession and the person that one has been in the past, transitioned to a person that one is going to be as a professional teacher in the classroom. To illustrate this point, let me just share with you some data from a study that I did actually quite a few years ago now, but still remains so relevant and poignant in some sense. So an activity I like to do in my classrooms with my teacher preparation students, which is actually something that I learned from a colleague, Maria Torres Guzman, who unfortunately passed away prematurely. She taught me this activity, although she and I use it very, very differently, and it's called the family dinner. So for my students, what I would ask them to do is to draw a picture of a sort of typical family dinner that would characterize dinner in their childhood or in their adolescence. I used to work in elementary or primary education, and so I would ask my students to think of themselves as primary age students. So here's an example of one such portrait of a family dinner. And you can see, and I encourage my students to put as much detail as they could think of to give us a sense of sort of what was ordinary and normal in their families. And so in this picture, you can see that dinner was always served at 8 o'clock, that dad was typically sitting in the living room watching some kind of sports event or news, that children sat at the table and they all had fixed seats, although they would fight for the one with the best view of the television. And the menu always had some kind of meat and some kind of starch or rice. And mother was always the one cooking the food and didn't seem to eat dinner because she spent most of her time in the kitchen. Here's a second example of a student who came from a large family. She had 6 sisters and brothers. And of course, there was mother, not of course, but in her case, there was mother and father. And she said, we sat at a big round table, but she said, I created a space between, in this drawing, at the table, between father and the rest of us. But she said, in reality, there was no space. All the space around the round table was filled in, but my dad, wherever he sat, was clearly the head of the round table. And so the space depicts the fact that he was very much the person in charge of the family. And the final drawing is of a student whose parents had divorced when she was quite young, whose mother was working out of the home. And so she had to learn to be quite independent and quite often ate dinner alone because her mother was working late. And so she had to take care of her own dinner. If you think about these 3 images, very personal and important images of notions of family and what it means to think about, rituals and cultural norms in your own history, you can see that each one of these students would come with very, very different personal knowledge about what family means and what is appropriate or not appropriate, or what the norms or shoulds ought to be in place. So this is why personal knowledge is critical, because it operates underneath the surface. It shapes and guides our actions and the decisions that we make. They are not bad. It is just that they are personal. And so this knowledge domain allows teachers to come to a conscious level of the biases that they might bring into the classroom and therefore into their interactions with their students. The second is contextual knowledge. And we all understand context as kind of the situation that's in place. So, you know, whatever situation that you enter, whatever classroom, whatever community, that you kind of have to pay attention and have some sense of understanding of how things work in that setting. But I feel as though our definition, our understanding of context and contextual knowledge is actually not deep enough. And to illustrate, let's think about this concept and this context called school. And again, just like personal knowledge, most people in the world, even if they haven't gone to school, have some sense of school because it is such a pronounced concept and institution in society. So this is school, and so is this. A third example, another. This is also school. And more recently, as because of the COVID pandemic, this is also school. So this idea of context has to go deeper than simply having an understanding of what is in place. Contextual knowledge is layered. So the context, and you can think of it sort of concentric circles, the context of the child in terms of family, in terms of capacity, in terms of interests, the context of the family, what their beliefs and norms are, the dreams and aspirations they have for their child, the context of the community, the context of the state or country, and of course, the national and then international context. But in addition to that, it's not simply sort of expanding environments, but it also is layers within those environments. So there are historical contexts. One example might be historical context around gender and ideas about what boys are like and what girls are like. Those are all conceptions that are associated with personal knowledge, but are also part of historical and political contexts that shape, again, what we do and how we think about teaching and learning. The third is pedagogical knowledge. And again, for anyone talking about teaching or learning, this seems pretty ordinary. Content, theories, methods of teaching, curriculum development, etc. But I'm here to talk about the fact that we need to think not about pedagogy, but about pedagogies, that there are multiple pedagogies. And some of them are operating unconsciously, but we need to bring them again to a conscious level. So there are feminist pedagogies that talk about gender equity. There are overall equity pedagogies that focus on how we ensure all students receive what they need in order to achieve the same results. There's culturally responsive pedagogy that takes into account the different circumstances, traditions, histories, and cultures that children bring with them that matter in their education. And a new pedagogy, I won't go through all of them, but a new pedagogy is trauma-informed pedagogy. And if you think about the COVID pandemic, the huge number of untimely deaths that families and children have suffered, the loss of social activity, the need to pivot and be resilient in a different environment. There are levels of sadness that communities are experiencing that we now need to take into account in our pedagogies. Of course, this notion of sociological knowledge focuses on diversity. And this is another concept that we talk about a great deal, but don't do so well in our actual practice. And the reason why is because sociological knowledge is the most challenging for teachers, because it touches upon issues that are connected to values, to deep-seated beliefs, to biases and stereotypes that are embedded in society. They are connected to how we feel ourselves, to our own historical experiences, as well as to our emotions. And yet, this kind of knowledge is most critical for teachers if they are truly to meet the needs of all students, as we say we want to, and as we say we should. So allowing teacher preparation to be a space, a safe but thoughtful space, an accepting but critical space for these sociological ideas around assumptions, biases, social sort of issues, is a way in which to enable teachers to go into their classrooms ready to at least raise the issues. It's hard to be prepared to deal with sociological knowledge and sociological issues in classrooms because, again, you are not certain about what is going to come up. And if we look at the world now, we know that these sociological issues of inequity, of racism, of all kinds of sort of oppressions, nationalism, seem to be increasing for a whole variety of reasons. So what we need to do is to prepare teachers to know how to deal with controversial issues, to learn how to engage in those conversations, to enable students to speak and also to hear one another, even if the viewpoints are not always, congenial. And finally is the idea of social knowledge, which goes beyond, it certainly includes cooperative learning, conflict resolution, and democratic processes, not in terms of, sort of political ideology, but democratic in terms of fairness, in terms of participation, in terms of distribution of resources, so that all students can benefit from the institution called schooling. But social knowledge is what we need to ensure justice and peace in the world. And it in creating a place of belonging, of sharing, of fairness, enabling students to solve their problems with thoughtfulness and words, to work together, to partner, to collaborate, to understand their connectedness is part of what we need to ensure our own survival in the future. So what does this all mean in terms of teacher preparation? If I were to kind of wrap it up into a big picture. The first is that these, and I will repeat what I said in the beginning, that because we cannot be future ready, because we simply cannot anticipate what will come at us tomorrow, we need to think about enabling our teachers to support students in creating a future, to help students imagine the future that they want, so that rather than anticipate what might be coming down the line, which in some ways I think is sort of a static process where you're always sort of looking for what is going to be happening, as opposed to working in an agentic sense, to be in charge, to direct a future, to actually have ownership and participation in a future that you imagine. The second, and this is definitely connected to the idea of sociological knowledge as well as social knowledge, and this is that the notion of partnerships, whether it's partnerships between students, whether it's partnerships between teachers in different classes in a school, whether it's partnerships among schools or partnerships between schools and other institutions, that the problems of the world and the importance, the stakes that are in place in the future are so critical that we simply cannot do this alone. So we need to think about how to enable ourselves as teachers, as well as teacher educators and as university faculty, to think about deep collaboration around big ideas, not discrete notions of content knowledge or passing examinations or what have you, but to really engage in reflection, to really engage in self-assessment and awareness, to really think about the different contexts in which we work in order to make connections so that we can solve the big problems that we know are in the future, even though we may not know what the future holds. And finally, we need to stop thinking about educating for something or teaching something. I've said this several times in my talk, and I cannot emphasize it enough, that we have lost sight, I think, of what the goal of schooling is, what an educated person looks like. The goal of schooling is not algebra or historical knowledge. Those are vehicles for getting at the educated person that we say we're trying to develop. So rather than teaching something, facts, skills, content, subject matter, we need to be using those as vehicles, as avenues for teaching someone, the human being at the center of the educational enterprise. And teaching someone requires us, again, to go deeper and to focus on the big ideas that are important in teaching and learning. I want to thank you again for your kind attention during this talk. Let me just stop the share and say to you, I hope that this generates some discussion, and I appreciate so much your presence here today at this conference. Thank you, and have a great conference. This generates some discussion, and I appreciate so much your presence here today at this conference. Thank you, and have a great conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such a wonderful reminders for us to rethink about the teacher education for the 31st century. Quite often we always ask about what are essential for being a teachers and the 21st century teachers. But now you further leading us to think about further far and about 31st century then. And what are essential knowledge and skills or dispositions of teachers. And now we just open the floor for discussions, okay? So you can either ask in English or Chinese. We do have translators to help, okay? So any thoughts in your mind and comments and questions? People are pondering. Professor Mao, do you have any questions? No? And Professor Zhou, and we do have many graduate students here as well. Just raise your questions. You can raise your hand and we can hand over the question. Oh, also our friends online, okay. Welcome to join the discussions. It's our privilege that we have Dr. Goodwin with us. Because she mentioned several domains, okay, that for us to reflect upon, how can we prepare the teachers for the future. Yes, Professor Zhou.
Professor Lin, very much impressive your speech. Lastly, your last point you mentioned about which we're not to educating something, but try to educating someone. But in this pandemic eras or in this COVID-19 influence or challenge for us, student or teacher cannot meet face to face. If we learn from online, how can we do this education someone? I think it's a great challenge. Can you say something about this? Thank you.
Can you hear us, Dr. Lin Goodwin? We cannot hear you. Okay, just a second. Okay, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, sure.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was not on mute. No, very good. Thank you so much for the question. And I think in response, I would challenge us to think about whether before the pandemic, when we were in face-to-face, in-person mode, that we were educating someone then. And I would argue that we have not been doing that for a long time. That we have been focusing on something, on content, on content, on content. Mm-hmm. That we have interpreted and defined learning as more and more knowledge, but not enough about differentiating instruction, that understands that the someones that we are educating are all different individuals and have different needs. We have been focusing on something, on content, on content, on content. Mm-hmm. That we have interpreted and defined learning as more and more knowledge, but not enough about differentiating instruction, that understands that the someones that we are educating are all different. So I understand that there's a lag in the transmission. So I just heard myself speaking, which is why I stopped. I'll continue just to say that regardless of the mode of instruction, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's online, whether it's distant, that the connection between teacher and student needs to focus on the human aspect of the educational enterprise. If you look at science of learning research, for example, it is very clear that one of the most important principles that supports both academic and social development is the climate of the class, nature of relationships between teachers and students and between students and students. But I think that we have moved, we long moved away from that in this kind of competitive environment where we have been rewarded and students have been rewarded for demonstrating that they are able to give back what we have given them. So I think that as we look, I think the pandemic in particular has demonstrated to us that we really need to think very differently about teaching and learning. And that a lot of what we teach, I know that Andreas Schleicher from OECD uses trigonometry as an example, that we continue to teach things that actually are not necessary because we continue to be focused on the something and not the someone. And we continue to be kind of captured by history of curriculum, what we used to do, what we've always done, what has been in place, as opposed to thinking about engaging learners in ways that they can be creative and agentic for the future.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Any other further questions? Okay. Personally, I'm very curious about what do you think the most important, teacher dispositions needed for the uncertainty situations?
Well, I think that a very critical disposition is, being sort of an inquirer and an observer, so that you are always paying attention to the data that you're receiving. The reality is that as teachers, we receive information all the time.
Yes.
It's just that we don't always pay attention to it. So our learners, our students, are giving us information. They give us information in their assignments. They give us information in their interactions in classrooms. They give us information in terms of what they choose to do and what they don't. So all that information should allow us to come to know students more closely, so that we are better able to create and design curriculum that is responsive to them. We can, connected to my previous point, we generally have one curriculum that we deliver. I mean, we literally deliver it as if it's a package. And then students are supposed to receive it. And some students can receive it just as it is. Some students require something more, but we don't give them more. Some students require something different, not different in terms of lowered expectations, but different sort of modes of instruction and participation. But you're not able to do that if your focus, again, is on the thing, which is the curriculum, as opposed to the someone, which is the students. So being open to learning from your students and all the information that they implicitly provide you is one of the most critical dispositions. A second is, I would say, collaboration. Not being afraid to ask questions, to connect with your colleagues, to know that you cannot do it alone. I just actually received yesterday confirmation of an article that's going to publication, focusing on an amazing teacher in New York City. And one thing she says is, I cannot do it alone. I need the help of the community. So if you were to visit her classroom, she would figure out very, very quickly. She would invite you to participate in her classroom. She would say, oh, you know how to do this? Can you come and talk to my students about it? Can my students contact you? Because she understands that the community is full of resources that her students can access. And her students are very successful, but they're also the students that no one expects to be successful. They come from very poor families. They are new immigrants. Many of them don't speak English well or at all. Many of them are not literate even in their native languages. They're students of color. They have come from interrupted schooling histories. I mean, the whole long list of sort of vulnerabilities is very, very long. But as I said, she is an amazing teacher who is very, very successful. Is what she does so unique? No, it isn't. But it is about a mindset, and that mindset is the second disposition, which is collaborating with others to educate your students.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Okay, one more. Okay, yeah, Professor Joe.
Professor Ling, your second point means about the textual knowledge student teacher have to learn or have to know. But in this pandemic eras, we maybe have to change the idea of the school, because we prepare students for what anything happens in the school. But nowadays, maybe they not go to in school, not in classroom, maybe in their home. Should we teach the student different style in the different space? Is my question. Thank you.
So I think I need some help because it was hard to hear everything. My apologies. So if you don't mind repeating, or if the host could just give me the essence. I know it had to do with contextual knowledge, I believe. And is it teaching students differently because of different contexts?
Because the textual knowledge, because Professor also mentioned about students actually are different home, probably the background will be different, and how the teachers helps, okay, because they are not contact them directly, but how the teacher being able to know the students, for example, like family support or whatever, and how to conduct the instructions to meet individual needs from different, family background and so forth. Is that right?
Right. Okay. Thank you. So the first thing I should say is that, again, the notion of students coming from different backgrounds, different families, different homes, different capacities is not new. So I think that, the great thing about the pandemic is that it really allowed us to see very clearly some of the things that we ignored in the past. So the notion of context, the different contexts that our students come from, became more visible, more relevant, and more salient during the pandemic. So part of what I worry about is, as the pandemic eventually, hopefully, will move to a different phase. I don't think it will ever leave us. As we, sort of transition back to more in-person activity and instruction, that we don't forget the important lessons that we've learned from the pandemic. So that's kind of the preamble. But a more direct answer to the question is that we have always used students' context. My concern is that that we have used students' context in a way to divide them and categorize them. So how we think about poor students versus wealthier students, how we think about minority students, whatever minority is in your context, right? Minority changes, but there's always some minority group, always some lower level group. We have used their context to position them as deficient, when in actual fact, their context should be used to enable us to be more creative in our instruction, and their context should be used to enhance what we do. So there's a lot of research around the notion of funds of knowledge. The fact that every child comes to school knowing lots of things. They may not know things that school cares about. They may not know their letters, their words. They may not know about things in museums, but they know about a lot of things. And so how can we use their contextual knowledge, their funds of knowledge, to enhance instruction? So that is sort of one answer to it. It is shifting our use of contextual knowledge because, as I said, we've always used it. We've just used it to categorize students so that the students on top always stay on top, and the students on bottom are always in remediation and seen as not capable, as opposed to capable but needing certain kinds of supports.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's a very good opportunity now to introduce to you the recent work, Who is in the Classroom Now? Okay, I think that's a wonderful book. Okay, you all can read that one, Who is in the Classroom Now? Teacher Preparation and Education of Immigrant Children. Of course, I think we can get a lot of implication from what you share in that book. And also, maybe last 5 minutes, okay, I would like to add one more question. Based on what you shared today, different domains, what teachers need to know and what kind of knowledge and skills and disposition they should have. Then, how about teacher educators? How do we change our curriculum or change our pedagogies or, to prepare future teachers, pre-service, as well as for teacher professional development? Any suggestions? That might.
Oh, millions
no,
of
just,
suggestions.
Yeah, just. I know you are good at this. Yeah.
It's a really excellent question, and in fact, I've done a fair amount of writing and research on teacher educators, because in the whole conversation about quality teachers, we have assumed that teacher educators are well prepared and know what they're doing. And the reality is there is no such preparation. When let's say experienced teachers decide to go on for further education, to get a PhD and to go into the university, if they have been teachers before, the assumption is that they can just transfer their previous teaching experience and that will be fine. But the reality is that schools are very different. And the teaching experience, I came from the classroom. My teaching experience is over 20 years old. Why would it be relevant to my students now? So that's number one. Number two, there are many people engaged in teacher education who have actually never themselves either studied education or been a teacher, because they teach a particular content area. And the focus has been on content. So one good example is child development. Quite often we teach child development from a psychology perspective, but not a psychology and education perspective. So then you have a lot of information about how children develop, but you have no understanding of how that development knowledge impacts your instruction, or how it impacts the learning process that students are involved in. So I think that your question raises a very, very serious issue that I've written about, which is that teacher educators, and I'm not the only one, there are more and more people. It's becoming more of a question that researchers are paying attention to, that there is a need for preparation of teacher educators. That the work of preparing teachers is also so complex that those who are engaged in that work need some formal training as well as formal understanding, and how to kind of build that relationship also for teacher educators between theory and practice. And one way to do it, of course, is to ensure that part of doctoral preparation for teacher educators, A, focuses on teacher ed, but B, really is connected to schools and practitioners. I'm currently actually, doing a study right now with some colleagues, asking teacher educators about their ideas, what they do in their curriculum and classroom to prepare teachers for working with immigrant students. And we're finding so far really interesting information. But again, most people are actually drawing on their own experience because they never learned it. It is through their own initiative and commitment that they engage in this work. And the preparation of teachers is so important. We cannot depend on individuals making a choice to learn more. It should be part of basic qualification to be a teacher educator. So yes, could not agree with you more that it is an important question, and it's actually an area that is ripe for research because there is not much work on it at all.
Okay, thank you. I hope we can get another chance for continued discussion on these issues in Taiwan or somewhere around the world. Okay, and thank you again very much. Please join me to thank you again, okay, for being with us for today.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to all of you. It's been enlightening as always. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, hope to see you in
Bye.
第一场主题演讲到此结束。接下来，我们有请第二场主题演讲主持人铆静茹副院长上台。第二场主题演讲由国立台湾师范大学教育学院铆静茹副院长主持，澳洲天主教大学 Professor Bob Lingard 主讲，讲题为 The Datafication and Digitalization of Education, Involving Developments and Emergent Issues。因疫情关系，本次主题演讲形式改为影片形式。影片播放完毕后，将会进行线上的即时问答，请与会贵宾多加包涵。The second keynote session begins now. Our speaker will be Professor Bob Lingard from Australian Catholic University. Professor Bob Lingard's topic is the datafication and digitalization of education, involving developments and emergent issues。接下来将时间交给主持人铆静茹副院长。Let's welcome the moderator, the Vice Dean, Dr. Mao Jingru from National Taiwan Normal University.
Okay, welcome everybody to this session. I am Jingru Mao. I chair this session. It's my great honor. We also have a great honor to invite the speaker, Professor Bob Lingard. I think the holding online and offline meeting at the same time is very challenging. We also have to use bilingual at the same time. I think Professor Lin already gave us a wonderful speech that told us how to prepare teachers for the uncertainty. And Bob Lingard's speech will provide more contextual knowledge about what do we face the uncertainty. Actually, Bob Lingard has a lot of books and publications relating to the issue of globalization. In the time of the globalization, we already face a lot. We say a lot of big data, and also we are living in a digital time. But it has evolved a lot of development, emerging a lot of very critical issues. So Bob Lingard will let us know those contexts. 那我简单介绍一下好了。Bob Lingard 因为长久以来他做了很多有关全球化的这个现象的观察，从最早就是我们有这种PISA 这种国际的测验，其实它就会用到很多 numbers， 很多的 big data。然后我们也看到这些 OECD 啊，或者是 UNESCO， 其实大家都会去观察整个国际发展的趋势。那今天 Bob Lingard 的演讲其实会告诉我们，就是有关 big data 或者是所谓数位，它对教育的影响。那在这几年，在学校教育里面，或者是在教育政策里面有哪些的发展？那这些发展里面其实也带来了很多很重要的 issues。 So we will let Bob's presentation to inspire us to think more thoughtfully and critically, and then we will have some time for audience to raise questions. So let's welcome Bob Linger. Thank you.
Collection of that data which goes up to the system, and that data is then held, is used to hold the teachers and schools accountable. A third way of describing thank you. I thank you for this invitation to deliver this keynote address to the National Taiwan Normal University and the Asia Pacific Association of Teacher Education. It's a privilege to do this. My talk is entitled The Datification and Digitalization of Education, Evolving Developments and Emerging Issues. I want you, as I speak, to recontextualize what I say to your context, national or local. I want you to recontextualize it to the work of teachers in your systems. And I want you to recontextualize to thinking about what I'm saying and its relevance for teacher education in different nations, in different locations. I want just to begin briefly by commenting on the intellectual resources I will be using in this keynote address. The first is a working paper, Digital Learning Assessments and Big Data, which I wrote with a couple of my colleagues here at Australian Catholic University. It's a paper we did for UNESCO. If you're interested, I'd invite you to read it. It's freely available on the UNESCO website, and it's freely available in several languages. So I will be drawing on that as one of the intellectual resources. And there's the reference for it. UNESCO set us a series of questions which we were asked to respond to in this working paper. And I will use those to direct my words a little later in this talk. The second intellectual resource is a book I edited with those same colleagues, and I'll be drawing in particular on the introductory chapter of that book, Digital Disruption in Teaching and Testing. And the opening chapter, a lengthy one, I wrote with my colleagues Claire and Elizabeth. The third resource is a chapter I have just completed with my colleagues here, Stephen Lewis and Jessica Holloway, Emergent Developments in the Datification and Digitalization of Education. And that's forthcoming in a book, which is in production currently with Routledge in New York, which I've edited with my colleagues Fazil Rizvi and Risto Reni, Reimagining Globalization and Education. So I'm looking at datification and digitalization, but I want to make the important historical point that numbers have been central to the functioning of the state for a long time. They make the nation legible for governing. Statistics, of course, are literally state numbers. Think of the census. Think of your National Bureau of Statistics. And statistics help construct the nation, unify the nation. And there's a whole literature here and interesting histories of statistics. Ted Porter's work and Des Roiser's work as well. So numbers have been central for a long time within the nation state and subnational units to the working of the state bureaucracy, to statecraft, to governance, to making up people. Nicholas Rose has said that numbers have a power as technologies of government, and I will argue that strongly in relation to datification and the digitalization of data. He also makes the point that single numbers, unemployment rate, inflation rate, scores on an international large-scale assessment of a schooling system, that those single numbers obscure all of the technical work that's gone into their construction, and decisions are made there. They are human-created figures and numbers, but they then help reconstitute the world and have effects in the world. But there's a black boxing often that goes on in relation to those numbers. So what's changed recently over the last decade or so in relation in particular to numbers and data and digitalization? Well, our computational capacities have increased hugely, and there's been a datification of the social and then a digitalization of that data, which has been enabled by the creation of data infrastructures and the interoperability of data sets, which are central now to governing within nations, governing within schooling systems. And there's been a move from what some say government to governance. And with governance, there's been a sort of thinning out of the bureaucracy. And under new public management, the centre of the bureaucracy, setting the desired outcomes, and then those who deliver them, teachers, doctors, they are held to account by the centre in terms of performance indicators or test results through numbers. And with our enhanced computational capacities, there's big developments going on in that space. And I'll say something about these. And I want you to think about and draw out the implications for the teaching profession, the need to re-professionalise the teaching profession, and what this also might mean in relation to teacher education. More recently as well, there's been another step towards network governance, where private sector actors, where philanthropists are involved with the state within policy development, implementation, involved in creating data infrastructures and so on. There's been considerable privatisation and commercialisation, involvement of the private sector, public-private partnerships and so on. And of course these work their way out in different ways in national and different subnational schooling systems. Jenny Oscar made a comment in an article in the Journal of Education Policy about the role of data in the new governance of education. And she said this: data production and management were and are essential to the new governance turn. Constant comparison is its symbolic feature, as well as distinctive mode of operation, comparison of school to school performance, national system to national system performance in international large-scale assessments. As a policy instrument, data grew and continue to grow in strength, speed and scope. The shift to governance is in fact heavily dependent on knowledge and information, which play a pivotal role both in the pervasiveness of governance and allowing the development of its dispersed, distributed and disaggregated form, a pushing out, a devolving out to tasks that those who deliver the service, but they're held to account through numbers, through data. Data support and create new kinds of policy instrument that organise political relations through communication information and hence legitimise the organisation. And if we're looking at schooling systems, national testing, international large-scale assessments, say such as PISA or TIMSS, PIRLS, that requires the practices of commensuration, creating the potential to do these comparative measures within a national system or across the globe. And there's a whole lot of work in that black box that goes on there as well. So let's think about the background to datification and digitalization of schooling. We've seen real digital disruption, and I'll come back to that. Enhanced computational and digital capacities. Think of the amount of data circulating within systems, and not only international large-scale assessments, not only national assessments, but administrative data, attendance data, data about teachers. So datification is the rendering of experience as data. Often when we have system data, there's a tension. So for example, PISA results aren't really helpful to individual teachers because they're about the system. And there's questions of the tension here between system and site, school, validity and use of the tests. And of course, data and datification have implications for teachers and teacher professionalism, the question of who controls the field of judgment. And there's the centrality, we know, of the quality of teacher knowledges and practices to the quality of learning and schooling applications. The evolution of these developments I'm talking about, and which are the focus of this address, have the potential to de-professionalize teachers, particularly in some global south nations, where the scripted teaching, scripted curriculum, scripted pedagogy, scripted testing, and teachers are just adjuncts, de-professionalized to that online work. We need a re-professionalization, and that UNESCO working paper of ours talks about that. And I think there's a debate and thinking that needs to go on amongst teacher educators, education academics, and indeed the broader education community. Some further background. We know there's a huge digital divide between the global south, global north, and within nations. 46%, according to UNESCO, of primary schools globally are connected to the internet, only 16% in the nations of the global south. The neoliberal politics, which has seen a lot of outsourcing to the private sector, public-private partnerships linked to the new governance, this space of data and digitalization, the restructured state, the new public management, network governance, new data-based accountabilities, high-stakes testing, holding schools and teachers to account. Sahlberg's talk of GERM, the global education reform movement, where there have been pressures within many nations across the globe to put schools in competition with each other, play up school choice, parental choice of schools, and the use of testing and comparative performance data to enable such choice. And we've got the private sector involved here, which raises interesting questions in terms of public schooling and its delivery in a democracy when you've got private sector involvement here. So I mentioned digital disruption, and in our UNESCO working paper, we define digital disruption in this way, and let me quote from that report for UNESCO, page 2. Quote, big data and digital learning assessments, more of that in a moment, digital learning assessments, are part of the broader digital disruption brought about by enhanced computational and digital capacities in terms of the volume, variety and velocity of data that now circulate both within countries and globally. Data themselves are not inherently disruptive. It's the datification of experience, and of course there's philosophical questions there, the datification of experience and the digitalization of data that are the sources of disruption. I want to move out to some bigger questions just for a moment, away from schooling systems, away from teachers and their work, and look at what's happening within societies. And of course this is affecting, having big impacts on schooling systems and teachers' work. Mao, M-A-U, in a lovely book written in 2019, a German sociologist, speaks of a metric society that we've moved towards. And I think schooling's caught within this. He talks about a general trend towards quantitative forms of social ranking, which are steadily involved into a hierarchical classification system. This book is about the emergence of a society of scores, rankings, likes, stars, and grades. It is concerned with data and indicator-based methods of evaluation and monitoring, which are encouraging a wholesale quantification of the social sphere. In short, it is a study of the all-pervasive phenomenon of sociometrics, or the metric society. Just think, you stay in a hotel, when you leave, you get a survey asking you to rank the service on a number of dimensions. And this auditing is what's occurring in schooling systems through data and the digitalization of data, through datification. Coldry and Mageas, in a book, The Costs of Connection, talk about the social quantification sector, and do so in their book on page 14. And they say that this sector consists of those who manufacture digital devices, Samsung, Microsoft, Apple, and so on. Also including the builders of computer-based environments, platforms, and tools. Also growing field of data brokers, and also the social quantification sector includes the vast domain of organisations that increasingly depend for their function on the processing of data from social life, where you're surveilled, the data is kept, and we have profiles. Netflix, Spotify, Airbnb, Uber, and Didio. Shoshana Zuboff, in a best-selling book also published in 2019, talks of an age of surveillance capitalism and the rendering of our experience as data. She defines surveillance capitalism, a new economic order that claims human experience as free, raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. Think, when we use Google, that's then used by Google to build niche and markets which and profiles of potential consumers and on selling to third parties. She raises a set of interesting philosophical questions which apply, of course, as well to schooling systems. She says that we render our data, and in a way, in so rendering, we're surrendering something. And she asks the question, can all social experience, can everything about schooling, datafied teacher, datafied student, datafied school, can all experience be rendered as data? But the deeper question, ought it be? And her argument is, as we render our data to these technological devices, that we are surrendering something. Many would say in the Australian system, where we have national testing and the teachers help in the collection of that data, which goes up to the system, and that data is then held, is used to hold the teachers and schools accountable. A third way of describing the broader trends are what Coldry and Mageas call data colonizing human life for capitalism. And with all of these, individuals, students, teachers are constituted as either data points or as constellations of data points. And if we look at the notion of data colonization, and I'll go back to their book, The Costs of Connection, and look at pages 11, where they define data colonization. Our first assertion is that everyday relations with data are becoming colonial in nature. That is, they cannot be understood except as an appropriation on a form and scale that bears comparison with the appropriation of historical colonialism. Our second argument is that this new colonialism does not just happen by itself, but is driven by the imperatives of capitalism. Our being, through the collection of data, the surrender, and the rendering of our experience as data, which Zuboff talks about, is then used, monetized, and has become central to a new emergent form of capitalism. This chapter I've written in that new book, Routledge, which will be published next year, Reimagining Globalization and Education, where we talk about changes in datification and digitalization, and the potential changes we talk about are of two kinds. That if you look at national testing now, or international large-scale testing, they tend to be point-in-time data and either a sample or census data, but not of all year levels. So PISA is the 15-year-olds, national testing in Australia years 3, 5, 7 and 9. The potential move with the intensification of datification and digitalization is to move to continuous real-time data collection, with cameras inbuilt to student computers, continuous assessment, continuous feedback. The second change is a move often from sample data to census data, that is all of a cohort. big data, about which I'll say something in a moment. So these are the questions that were set by UNESCO for us, and I'll attempt to answer each, and I want you to draw the implications for teachers, teacher professionalism, teacher education, and for schooling systems. The first, what are digital learning assessments and how have they evolved? What are digital learning assessments and how have they evolved? So we've moved from pen and paper tests, and then they were put onto computers. And in some ways, in the first iterations there, they were no different from the pen and paper test in that they were simply done online. And they were scored, marked, if you like, by human beings. The next move was to structure the tests in such a way, computer-based testing, so that the results were scored by machines. We've then moved to computer adaptive testing, CAT, in which there is branching. And this computer adaptive testing with branching is designed to adapt the test items to the capacity of the students to answer the questions, linked to student interest levels, and providing us more nuanced data. Computer adaptive testing, where there are adjustments often at various points in a test, and algorithms determine whether the students got this set of questions wrong, so they will go to easier questions. Got some wrong, they'll go to medium range. All right, they'll go to more difficult questions. And this is framed by a testing theory, item response theory. Now we can see how multiple choice questions, this might work, but in terms of writing and prose, and there's a very vigorous debate about whether computers, through automatic essay scoring systems and the like, can mark written prose in a way equivalent to the judgment of human beings. So this model I have, which you should have on your PowerPoint, what we have is question, then a first branching point where it goes into harder and easier questions, then perhaps a second branching point, more challenging, mainstream, easier. And purportedly, this gives us data results whereby we know more about those who perform poorly and more about those who perform very well. Whereas when we have the one test, not computer adaptive testing for all, it tells us very little about high performers and low performers. So, computer-based testing to computer adaptive testing. There's the potential as well, not just for summative assessment measures here, but also formative. The next move, and I won't say much about this, and you can think about it and imagine this, is a move to immersive assessments. The use of artificial intelligence, virtual, mixed, extended reality simulations. Think about how pilots learn to fly planes in a simulated cabin of a plane. We could think about how there could be simulations of laboratory activities. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the way all systems are moving, or indeed that they ought, from computer-based, computer adaptive to immersive, and that all knowledge forms lay themselves open to virtual reality. But I have been in an experimental classroom in Japan where the students were studying the ocean and life within the ocean, and I sat in a classroom surrounded by sharks and other animals and the ocean as a virtual reality. What does all of this mean in terms of teachers and who controls the field of judgment with assessment? And so the general move, learning analytics, virtual experiential assessments, which of course could be authentic, that argument of authentic assessment, formative as well as summative. There are other assessment apps, and many of you would know of these: intelligent tutoring systems, reading eggs, math seeds, and the like. Behaviour management apps, which many schools, Class Dojo, there's one of these for parents now. And these are often about developing the data and big data disposition we've found that there's extensive use of these sort of formative assessment apps in Australian schools. Second question, which assessment data can be classified as big data and who owns it? I have a quote from Ben Williamson from his book on this, a SAGE book, which I encourage you to read. He says, in technical terms, big data refers to data sets that are huge in volume at the scale of petabytes, exabytes, and zettabytes. So there's volume. Highly diverse in type and nature. Generated continuously at great velocity, in or near real time. That is velocity, real time. Volume, velocity, real time. Exhausted in scope, enabling the capture of entire populations, n equals all rather than sampled selections. Fine-grained in resolution at the level of indexing individual units, combinable with other networks of data sets, and flexible and scalable enough for new fields to be added and to expand in size rapidly. So big data necessitates cloud storage, and we talk of volume, variety, velocity, real-time collection of data. I would say this will become more important in the governance of schooling systems and the work of schools and teachers and students. I would say at the moment we don't have much big data. It is more than just large amounts of data. There's issues around this, of course, whether systems have got the computational capacities, the infrastructure. There's large amount of private sector involvement in the provision of such infrastructures, a sort of hidden privatization. It's interesting to me that one of the most cited papers about this matter in relation to schooling is one by Hill and Barber, which was written for Pearson, the world's largest edubusiness. In terms of interoperability framework, so data sets can talk to other data sets, it's interesting that it was the private sector, Microsoft, Bill Gates, and other businesses, other edtech businesses, which have developed the systems interoperability framework, which is used in Australia. There's questions of surveillance, data valence, data privacy, and ownership. There's a case which has been written about quite extensively when in the US, under President Obama's race to the top, he wanted data infrastructures and data systems in all schooling systems at state level. And 11 eastern states in the US were trying to develop and make interoperable their data. There was a lot of money from the Gates Foundation. Parents opposed it and have eventually stopped this because their concern was about the potential for the private, the edgy businesses, which were managing the data, to on-sell it to third parties. Japan, as far as I'm aware, is the only society which has privacy legislation, which says that the data governments collect can only be used for the purposes for which they were collected. If we think as well about big data, science, of course, did samples or collected large data and then looked at correlations and wanted to speculate about causation and talk about why something occurred. With big data, we know what's occurred, but we don't know why, which is interesting. The Australian example that sometimes think might be big data is our national testing, 3, 5, 7 and 9, but it's not. It's a one-off test only for years 3, 5, 7 and 9 in May each year. It's now in a computer adaptive mode, but it's not big data. There's some move in that direction in Australia with the creation of the Australian Educational Research Organisation, which is hoping to get into some of this predictive. So who owns the data? Big data, continuous tracking and monitoring, real-time analytics, often done by for-profit businesses. So what about the data collection? Who owns it? Ownership, ethics, privacy. It's interesting, Pearson, the world's largest business, talks about their stewardship, not ownership of data. The European Commission recently has said that data protection and privacy, particularly for data infrastructures in the public sector, that questions of protection and privacy need to be built into the very design of the data infrastructure. So who owns the data? Ben Williamson in that book has said there are considerable unresolved concerns. They remain about the adequacy of contemporary student privacy and data protection policies and frameworks in relation to the rise of educational data science practices of big data, analytics and data mining. How do coding then, the next question, and software shape what is measured? And what are the dangers of biases in algorithms and algorithms self-training themselves for future use? And it's here, of course, when big data sets talk to each other and then the algorithm and the machine learns through machine learning and gives us some particular sorts of insights. What is going on here, and are there biases built into this? Because data, of course, has been collected in the past, and if we're doing and using it in systems for policy in a predictive sense, is there an assumption that the future is simply a continuation of today and yesterday? So there is the way in which algorithms, there are biases built into their very construction. Who constructs them? For what purposes? They inevitably shape what is measured. And the question of human judgment, teacher judgment, and this datification and digitalization is a really, really important one. Like Mittelstadt says, algorithms' design and functionality reflect its designers and intended users, their inbuilt assumptions. If we think for a moment about artificial intelligence and what's the role of human judgment, Erica Southgate, in a paper on AI in our book, Digital Disruption in Teaching and Testing, says this: every day in a myriad of ways we interact with AI. Computing applications such as internet search engines, smartphone assistants and chatbots, social media facial recognition, tagging technology, fun filters, ride-sharing apps that determine journey pricing, and recommended product advertising are all powered by AI. AI can be embodied in robots, but not all robots have AI, or often invisibly infused into computing applications and systems. She then gives the OECD's definition of AI. Quote, a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. AI systems are designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy, unquote. But remember, they're based upon data, who constructs the data, and data have this recreative role in reconstituting that which it is seeking to represent. And it's interesting to think about how that works in relation to artificial intelligence. Are real-time automated and constant testing and assessment analytics narrowing conceptions of learning and what is taught? The fourth question UNESCO put to us. If you think about it, there's talk, much talk, certainly in the Australian system, the US, in parts of Europe, and I imagine, of course, in parts of Asia, about the move to personalisation through the collection of big data, through continuous surveillance and assessment of student work. So on the basis of the big data, and a sort of standardization, paradoxically, there's the potential for the personalization of schooling to each individual. But of course there are real dangers here. What about the broader civic and social purposes of schooling? What about the erasure, potentially, of children's own decision-making processes? And there are broader philosophical questions. If it is the ed tech companies, the edu businesses moving in with all of their capacity, and of course COVID and schooling from home has opened up a real market and business opportunity for the big ed tech companies, the edu businesses. I mean, the question of who should determine curriculum, edu businesses or the state, and the state, of course, democratically elected governments representing the desires of the population at large, constituting the curriculum. So, let me come to some concluding comments here and think about, and ask you to think about, really contemplate what the matters I've been talking about mean for schools, schooling systems, importantly for teachers and their professionalism, and the knowledges that teachers need in this world. And I would argue a need for re-professionalisation, a need to put human judgments, the teacher judgments, alongside the datification, the digitalisation, the move from computer-based to computer-adaptive to immersive assessments, the virtual realities. There's much hope that big data will enable a sort of anticipatory government along with artificial intelligence. But I would say at the moment we don't have much of it in schooling systems. It's elusive, it's emergent, not extant. There are questions of ethics, privacy, ownership of data, and the danger always with the involvement of ed tech companies of the on-selling for profit to third parties. And I think parents will always, always be wary of that. There is the environmental impact. And it's interesting, in preparing for this talk, I've read 2 papers which have just come out in the last few days. One by Neil Selwyn in e-learning and digital media, and there's a bibliography, a reference list with my PowerPoint, which I've sent to the conference organisers, and I hope you get access to. And Neil Selwyn's paper, EdTech Within Limits, Anticipating Educational Technology in Times of Environmental Crisis. And a second, in the journal Learning, Media and Technology, a journal I'd encourage you to look at, and a paper, an editorial paper, entitled Shifting Scales of Research on Learning, Media and Technology by Felicitas McGilchrist, John Potter and Ben Williamson. And Ben Williamson has written voluminous amounts on these sets of matters. And both of these papers are raising the environmental impact of this datification, digitalisation, and all of the impacts of the things I've been talking about on schooling systems, the provision of schooling. And they make the point, the paper in Learning, Media and Technology, let me quote, "The planetary scale life cycle of the tablets, notebooks or smartphones used for learning, as well as myriad other devices, is temporal and spatial." So you think of the wastage, our iPhones, we have to get one, a new one every year as the new model comes. What happens to the old? What are the environmental impacts of that? But what are the environmental impacts of the cobalt, the lithium, the materials, the minerals that are required to build them? They say the geological deep time of metals and minerals, like copper for wiring, cobalt for circuits, coating cobalt wires, borax for microprocessors, and camera chips, goes back millennia. That is, takes a long time for those to be produced. Digital rubbish leaves a long-term toxic impact on the Earth's surface, and they go on. But I think I've made the point, and so they're saying that there's always this optimism about the technology, and of course much of it's driven by the edgy businesses themselves. I mean, many of the edgy businesses have offered critiques of traditional schooling. If we take New York, the previous governor, Governor Cuomo, in the middle of the COVID crisis there, the pandemic, when the schools were closed, he set up a commission by the ex-head of Google involving the Gates Foundation and said, why do we need schools with walls? Look what's happened during COVID. We've used all of this technology. It's interesting, no educators involved, but being driven by edgy businesses. And this brings us to the role of the state and of for-profit edgy businesses. Who should be determining what happens in schools? And more importantly, what is the place of teachers and teacher knowledge, human judgment? I think it's human plus machines, human plus data, human plus digitalization, human plus big data, and so on. And I think there's a very real need for investment in the re-professionalisation of teachers. In Australia, the teacher standards say teachers should be able to utilise, understand and use data to improve their pedagogical practices and the learning of their students. But I think much more than that is needed. I think the things I've been talking about need to be in the dispositions and understandings of teachers. And the points I'm making apply even more to nations in the global south. And the last point I want to come to is use attention that Arjun Appadurai has written about in his book, The Future as Cultural Fact, Essays on the Global Condition. And he talks about the tension between an ethics of probability and an ethics of possibility. And the ethics of possibility is a future which is determined in democratic dialogue between people. And the same would be exactly true for the future of schooling. Whereas opposed to that is the ethics of probability. You know, all this data we have and says this is what's going to happen into the future. Tomorrow, a continuation of yesterday. And of course, the ethics of probability is helpful in relation to climate change. The question is, what's the relation between the two? And my point would be the human has to play with the data. Human judgment has to be involved, and that's as true of teachers and all of the data which now suffuses schooling systems. And I would implore you to have a look at the most recent, released just a few days ago, UNESCO report produced from their International Commission on the Futures of Education. Their report, Imagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And that is certainly situated within Appadurai's ethics of possibility and the use of the
I just learned that Professor Linga has not been online.我想我用中文稍微介绍一下，我刚跟大会说，我来帮忙接收问题好了，就是说大家如果有相关问题，那 Ballinger 其实他在 Sociology of Education 跟 Education Policy 还有 Curriculum Studies 其实是一个非常leading figures。我在2010年的时候在爱丁堡大学，然后刚好他刚刚也有提到有一个作者叫 Jamie Oscar， 我是在他的 sponsorship 下当 visiting scholar， 那我们就读了Ballinger 的书。之后呢，我就开始一系列追踪他相关的研究，所以他一直很关心 globalization 啊，你会看到他一系列的作品，其实都会跟globalization and education 或者是globalizing education policy， 然后还有他现在很关心的有关这个 digital 怎么去 disrupt 在教学上面，然后刚其实有特别提到，因为我们就很习惯性的我们就去拥抱了 big data 大数据这件事。那他刚刚就在把 big data 这个好像是一个名词，他把它动词化。那data filing schools, data filing teachers, data filing students， 他就告诉我们说，在这个过程里面，其实这些什么样的东西会变 big data， 然后经过一个什么样的过程？他刚刚就是介绍了这个 evolving development 给我们看，然后特别在这个科技时代 digital time 里面，我们也是蛮乐观，就是说也很善于或也得使用这些 digital technology。可是不管是 digital technology 留下的这些 student assessment， 那后端是谁问了什么样的问题，是留下了这些 assessment 的 data， 然后呢，谁会 own 这些 data， 这些都是一些很重要的问题。所以他这里面有提到，他刚后面 UNESCO 他有给我们看到报告，然后他自己本身也是参加 UNESCO 的 paper initiator。那里面他有问，他有提到那3个问题，其实都还蛮重要，也就是他跟我们一起讨论这个 emergent issues， 所以我觉得 it's real insightful and inspiring speech for us today, especially in the uncertainty of the time that we have to deal with a lot of not only emergent issues, but also very critical issues we have to deal with in the future. 那不知道大家就是我们现场有没有一些问题，或者是说你的 response 听了以后的相关的问题，或者是我们线上也可以。我们还有couple minutes， 5分钟，谢谢院长。
I have a question about online testing. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, school teachers have to conduct online teaching extensively, but we still lack of standardized online exam for every subject. So teachers have to design their online exam for their students. And therefore, there are a lot of controversies in online exam, including fairness and validity. So, can you give us some suggestion about how to improve the feasibility of online exam for school teachers? Thank you.
That question? Okay, because the speaker was not online. 不知道什么原因，就是可能没有联系上，所以他没有在线上。对对，好，刚院长我变中文翻译了。Okay, it's very challenging for us online and offline. Holding a conference at this time is very uncertain. Yeah. And also very challenging for us. 刚院长其实问的是说，其实我们台湾现在也很多学校跟老师也都有，当我们在线上学习的时候，那原本我们习惯传统式的这个 assessment， 我们现在面临到在线上，那这个所谓的validity 嘛，跟那个 fairness 公平的问题，我们怎么处理？这样，这的确是一个非常 critical issues。对 ，not emergent but very critical for us right now。对，那我不知道译者听不清楚，无法翻译。OK， 线上有问题吗？好。
就是从用途上来讲，那么他举到的一些公司，他们基本上就是私有化，或者说是私人要去用那些东西嘛，就透过这些数据资料，最后他的目的是 marketing， 然后又要做行销这样的方式。那这样观念放到教育里面，在教育的过程里面也会产生很多的那个大数据的资料。那特别提到评量这件事情，那如果我们同时这样想说，医疗里面他们也会用。可是用的它那个目的是为了做诊断、做治疗，它不一定是为了赚钱。可是对我们来讲，我们把这个大数据资料做下来之后，特别是评量资料拿下来之后，我们最后结果是要判断学生的那个成绩。那似乎好像那个用途跟医疗的用途就是变成很自然的走到，就是会走到是那个像商业用途，或者说是怎么讲，对学生来讲那是一个不利的那个资料。所以在这个里面，用途上，第一个是要不要做区分。第二个，如果说它有那个被误用的可能性，就是有可能会做成学生不是为了要改进教学去用，而是作为评断学生有这么大一个资料库，你的等级放得更清楚的时候，而且没有一个人逃得掉的时候，那个时候就会牵扯到第二个问题，就是这个资料谁该拥有。谁有权去接触这个东西？我想他在这里面有提到这个问题，而且这个确实是很重要，需要来思考的。以上，
我们2位院长帮忙提问跟帮忙思考这些，其实我觉得是非常critical issues。我们需要处理的，像刚刚讲到 validity 或者是 fairness， 那刚我们周院长其实提到的是，我们在这个 data 到底是谁处理用在什么方式，特别像医疗，其实他们也蛮重要的哈。然后刚其实他是有提到日本其实是有规定，你收集资料的时候，当初说你的目的是什么，你就只能用在那个，他就不能全部很多从 不同的目的。然后这里面其实他们有提到一些 private 的 companies 在处理这件事的，所以他刚刚有提到那个 ethic 伦理的问题，我觉得这些都是很 pounding issues we had to rethink and redo our practice in of the school in the futures。那由于时间的关系，我们已经超过一点点，那很谢谢两位院长提供很好的思考。然后巴林格的演讲有一点小可惜，他虽然没有办法来线上，不过他也帮我们提了很多问题，大家可以一起来思考，然后让我们去面对2030甚至3030的未来。哈，谢谢，谢谢大家，谢谢。
第2场主题演讲到此结束，接下来是休息时间。下一场主题演讲开始时间为11点30分，请各位来宾准时进入会场，谢谢您的合作。It's time for a break. The next session will begin at 11:30 a.m. Please come back in time. Thank you. 祥副院长。Let's welcome the moderator, the Vice President, Dr. Yan Qingxiang from National Academy for Educational Research.
好，谢谢。我想这个场次是最单纯的哈因为时差的关系因为 Edward Vickers 在 Professor 在英国，所以我们等一下是用录影的方式哈来全程播出。那播出的时间大概40分钟39秒。那另外就是因为这样的关系，所以没有 Q&A 的那如果有进一步想要理解的，其实他在日本九州大学任教，也可以有这个 email 的往返，应该或许也可以跟他做一些讨论。那他谈的主题呢，Professor Vickers 谈的主题主要是在重新思考后疫情时代我们对教育的定义、教育的价值跟教育的目的。各位都知道，其实对教育的重新思考，一直都是在一个全球化的时代，各国都是要面对的。那有时候人类都是要面对一个重大的冲击之后，才开始去做一些反思。那以后这种反思呢，应该不会只有在后疫情时代，而是每个阶段都应该好好去面对。比如说他提到就是说，那教育的定位是要为国家的人才资本的培育往这个方向走，作为他的教育的总体目标，还是说我们也应该思考教育的本质是要促进个人的充分发展跟自我实现，然后让他的人生的生命可以圆满。那这都是向来都是一个争论。那我也知道，从国际比较教育的角度来看，事实上对这个教育的一个追求，各国的定位是不一样的。那特别在后疫情时代，刚才教务长的开场讲了一段话，我很肯认，就说在确保教育品质之下，那是不是也要看见教育的公平跟正义有没有相一致？那这个确实是如此。根据英国在2020年的调查，疫情时代之后，他们的中小学生的学习成就很明显的因为线上学习而落差了20%，等于说降低了20%的一个学习成效。那虽然有透过数位化、透过线上，但是事实上人类可以这样就弥补了这样的一个学习的成长。但是话又说回来，学习的内容跟教育目标的追求难道就会这样被绑住了吗？我们就不能进行跨域教学了吗？我们就不能够进行教学创新了吗？连一个疫情时代的管理员都问你说，他都成为一个哲学家，问你从哪里来，你要往哪里去？这个都平常我们可能不会想到的。我们的老师也成为直播主，变成网红这样，所以整个都在变化。所以教育的角色跟功能是不是也要去重新思考？不过 Professor Vickers 特别强调社会的公平正义这件事情，也是我非常的一个认同的。他本身是在英国牛津的历史学现代历史，拿到学士跟硕士学位，后来到香港大学拿到历史跟课程的一个博士学位。那目前是在日本九州大学任教。以我对他的专长跟他写过的文章的了解，他是比较用一种历史的纵深的角度，我觉得很好。来观察，特别是东亚的教育的一个制度跟政策的变化。那他本身呢，因为有这样的背景，所以他提出很多批判性的思考。那接下来的40分钟，就让 Professor Vickers 来让我们一起来互相探讨今天他所带来的主题。好，再次先跟大家致意，谢谢大家。
Hello. I'd like to warmly thank Professor Lin and colleagues at NTNU for inviting me to give this speech at your conference. I hope the recording works okay, and I'm very sorry we have to do it this way, and I'm not able to actually come to Taiwan and meet you all. So without further ado, I'm going to get on with my talk. Now, in this talk, I consider the educational ramifications of COVID-19 from a broader political and socio-economic perspective. Focusing primarily on Asia, I discuss implications for a number of challenges identified in a 2017 report that I co-authored for UNESCO, Rethinking Education for the 21st Century. These were challenges of instrumentalism and values, of nationalism and weak regionalism, and of competitiveness and regimentation. My broad conclusion is that the COVID pandemic has significantly exacerbated these challenges. At the same time, I argue that by dramatizing the unsustainability of prevailing approaches to education, this crisis could and should perhaps spark a more fundamental rethink. Why focus on Asia? One reason is the accelerating shift in the global center of political gravity from the West towards Asia. The relative success of many East Asian societies in controlling COVID contrasts, I think, with the shambolic incompetence of some Western governments. Notwithstanding more recent vaccine successes in the West, that spectacle of Western failure undermines any lingering belief that it is natural or makes sense to look to the West for solutions to humanity's shared problems. But does shattering the illusion of Western superiority necessarily lead to a more sustainable and humane approach to education? I think this is more doubtful. Autocrats across Asia and elsewhere have long sought to delegitimize liberal or universal visions of human rights by associating them with an alien West. Responses so far to COVID-19 point to an intensification of chauvinism and xenophobia, not least in Asia. And I think this constitutes perhaps the greatest challenge we face today. To confront chauvinist ideologies, we first have to understand their appeal. This requires understanding how education actually divides us, not just through curricular messages, but through its systems and structures. Here, I think it's crucial to consider the dominance in global educational debate of an instrumentalist, dehumanizing conception of meritocracy. This phenomenon has been associated by some observers with the post-2008 surge of populism in the West. However, many Asian societies exhibit similar tensions in even starker form. Here, I'll focus primarily on the cases of China, India, and Japan. Let's look first at the responses to COVID by major international agencies involved in education, such as UNESCO, the OECD, or the World Bank. Here we certainly find some variation. So the OECD focuses primarily on skills, growth, and the promise of technology. UNESCO adopts a rather broader perspective, drawing attention to the importance of schools as social spaces and to the pastoral role of teachers. But UNESCO has joined a general embrace of educational technology, forming a global educational coalition with sponsorship from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and other big tech corporations. These are the same companies whose massive, lightly taxed profits actually take away resources from public schooling. Multilateral agencies have tended to focus primarily on challenges to educational delivery, neglecting issues of content. In global educational debate, it's generally assumed that schooling is in and of itself a good thing. We too seldom consider how education contributes to tensions within and between our societies. In fomenting hatred and mistrust or promoting unsustainable environmental or economic attitudes, schooling can have deeply malign social and political consequences. And the same applies to education's role in allocating resources and opportunities within societies. Various observers have highlighted the risk of increased inequality resulting from the COVID pandemic, but the sorting function of schooling is seldom portrayed as fundamentally problematic in itself. Indeed, in recent reports, both the OECD and the United Nations have called for refinement and intensification of the assessment of educational outcomes. Faith in the transformative potential of education is a kind of gospel for today's global elite. We seldom hear speeches at Davos advocating redistributive taxation to fund enhanced public goods or to guarantee security and dignity for everybody. Education, on the other hand, is widely hailed as a magic bullet, as if broadening access, raising skills, and transforming consciousness were all sufficient to put the world to rights. But the belief that education can painlessly bring about a sustainable utopia is both completely unrealistic and it imposes a massive burden on teachers and on young people themselves. In the 2017 Rethinking Schooling report, we highlighted the link between a fundamentalist brand of meritocracy in many Asian societies and pervasive insecurity, involving minimal public welfare provision, rigid and stratified labor markets, and so forth. We concluded that curricular messaging concerning peace and sustainability was meaningless if young people's lives were marred by this kind of insecurity. If we seek to persuade young people to care about our common future, we wrote, it would help to give them a real stake in it. The critique of meritocracy has since gone global. Yale University's Daniel Markovits observes how life in America has been transformed into a massive multi-stage meritocratic tournament since the mid-20th century. Referring to the USA's chaotic response to the COVID pandemic, the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel writes that increasingly globalized elites felt that their economic prospects and identities were no longer dependent on local or national communities. As the winners of globalization pulled away from the losers, they practiced their own form of social distancing, he writes. At the same time, he's argued, the sense among globalization's losers that those on top look down on them with disdain fuels the anger and resentment that draws them to authoritarian populists. A catastrophic erosion of social solidarity destroys the grounds for believing that we are all in it together. For example, when we face a crisis like COVID-19 or climate change. These studies offer compelling analyses of American societal dysfunction, but their failure to draw comparisons with Asia is striking, especially given that Asia is arguably where meritocracy began, with China's competitive civil service examinations. The French economist Thomas Piketty, in his monumental book, Capital and Ideology, also discusses the invention of meritocracy, but exclusively with reference to Europe. Piketty, nonetheless, has much to say about inequality in Asia, and he portrays both China and India as societies of hyper-concentrated wealth. In China, a 2015 study found that urban students were 43 times more likely than their rural counterparts to enter Peking or Tsinghua universities, even before socioeconomic class is taken into account. Now, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea are rather more equal societies, but inequality is rising there too. As in China, the immense costs of preparing children for meritocratic competition across East Asia are often cited as a key factor in these societies' extremely low birth rates. And yet, despite the intensity of meritocratic competition there, East Asian societies have remained relatively stable and cohesive in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Policy responses were starkly different. Japan, Korea, and Taiwan avoided China's draconian lockdowns, relying instead on mask wearing, social distancing, and testing. Nevertheless, East Asia has avoided the sort of collapse of social solidarity of the kind that we've witnessed in America, or to some extent in Britain. To what extent can this apparent social harmony in East Asia be attributed to education then? A 2020 study of education, inequality, and meritocracy in Japan by Kariya Takehiko and Jeremy Rapelye provides some intriguing pointers here. Drawing a contrast with the Western focus on student individuality, the authors argue that Japan's approach implies a trade-off along two axes: achievement of social equality versus freedom for emergence of individual differences. The Japanese system takes almost no account of individual differences in terms of family background, innate ability, or culture. This emphasis on uniformity through the standardization of educational inputs is largely responsible, Kariya and Rapelye argue, for creating a culture of weak individuality. Merit in this context comes to be associated overwhelmingly with the effortful assimilation of standardized knowledge and behavioral norms, rather than the cultivation or expression of individual distinctiveness. In other words, meritocratic competition in Japan involves competing to conform. Who can conform the best? China's approach to meritocracy is very different from Japan's. Rather than rigorously enforcing uniformity in educational inputs, post-Mao China has promoted blatantly elitist education within the public system. Ironically, anti-elite violence during the Cultural Revolution 40 years ago fueled a radical reversion to educational elitism during the reform era. And as economic growth and national strength rather than class struggle have become its guiding principles, China's Communist Party has proudly celebrated meritocracy as an element of outstanding Chinese traditional culture. That Chinese celebration of meritocratic tradition points to one key distinction between East Asian and Anglo-American forms of meritocracy. As Sandel observes, American elites parade their globalist credentials, their cosmopolitan, and their respect for diversity. The association of meritocracy with rootless cosmopolitanism helps explain the nativist rejection of experts in America and Britain, for example, by supporters of Donald Trump. As Markowitz puts it, for those outside the highly skilled, globally mobile elite, this intense concern for diversity and inclusion carries an odor of elite self-dealing. By contrast, meritocratic ideology in East Asia has been associated with exclusionary forms of ethno-nationalism. Even where, as in China, elites have become increasingly globalized domestically within the country, they have been careful to adopt a nationalist posture. Thomas Piketty identifies social nativism as a trap for post-communist and post-colonial societies, experiencing spiraling inequality and economic globalization. But in East Asia, nativism is not a response to new stresses in the social fabric, but it's a long-standing and integral feature of the developmental state. If East Asian societies have not yet witnessed a major anti-elite backlash, this may be partly because meritocracy there has always come wrapped in the national flag. In discussing the relationship between education and the handling of the current pandemic, evidence remains patchy. It's nevertheless possible tentatively to identify ways in which the COVID-19 crisis is influencing the terms of debate on education across Asia. Beyond the often harsh reality of lockdowns, school closures, and experiments with distance learning, it is also important to notice the stories told about the pandemic and how these are used to legitimate certain policy responses. It's these ideological or cultural ramifications of the crisis that I'll say more about now. First, however, I'll briefly review the nature and extent of educational disruption in Asia. Here, the performance of different Asian societies has been starkly divergent. After a strict 3-month lockdown, by April 2020, China was reopening schools across the country. In Japan, school closures lasted a total of just 24 days, the shortest in the world. But across Southeast and South Asia, the pandemic has had devastating consequences for education and societies. In the Philippines, most schools remain closed 18 months after lockdowns were first imposed, with many of the most disadvantaged students unable to access even the very patchy online instruction that was on offer. In South Asia, India, Pakistan, and so forth, disruptions to schooling and livelihoods has also severely affected poor and rural populations, especially women and girls. In India, policymaking elites have enthusiastically promoted digital provision of education, but the government's own figures indicated that fewer than a quarter of Indian households had internet access. The United Nations reported that 147 million South Asian children were unable to access any form of remote learning. There's also a significant gender divide in access to technology, with women's access to mobile phones often governed by male relatives. Prolonged lockdowns have also brutally exposed the malign consequences of South Asia's fashion for low-cost private schooling as an alternative to state provision. In early October 2020, the Times of India reported that in just one Indian state, Telangana, close to 10,000 private budget schools were staring at closure. Access to schooling is vital not only to children's welfare, but also to any credibility for claims of meritocracy. But there are so far no signs that the impact of the pandemic has prompted any fundamental rethink of the premises of education policy across Asia or indeed elsewhere. Instead, Asia's two most populous and powerful nations, China and India, in those countries, the pandemic has seen an intensification of authoritarian technocracy and the further undermining of humane and sustainable approaches to education. Our 2017 Rethinking Schooling report identified instrumentalism as a fundamental challenge to education for peace, sustainable development, and global citizenship. Instrumentalism signifies a narrow emphasis on education's role in human capital formation, treating people essentially as tools for the pursuit of corporate or state-determined goals. The notion is captured by the famous image of a hapless Charlie Chaplin caught in the cogs of a giant machine in the 1936 film Modern Times. Just as some observers in the 1930s associated fetishization of industrial technology with the rise of totalitarianism, we sought in our report to draw attention to the dangers posed by a narrowly instrumentalist conception of education. This doesn't imply rejection of technology, but an insistence that it should serve humanity, not subjugate us. In the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American sociologist Lewis Mumford argued that the machine came into our civilization not to save man from work, but to make possible wider servitude to ignoble standards of consumption. The German Jewish thinker Hannah Arendt argued that totalitarianism was the last stage in a process during which science has become an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the nature of man. She also argued that in a world where all human activities have been transformed into laboring, alienated and isolated individuals were easier to control through state-sponsored terror. Indeed, she described totalitarianism as organized loneliness, with totalitarian movements offering individuals a form of escape from their loneliness. Our contemporary world of rampant marketization, social insecurity, and authoritarian populism offers disturbing echoes of this dystopian vision. A more optimistic view of the potential of technology was offered in the 1930s by the British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes foresaw that thanks to advances in productivity, by 2030, the wealth generated by the global economy would be sufficient to release humanity from the old struggle for subsistence. Now, he was basically correct about the trajectory of global growth and rising productivity. However, we have clearly failed to rise to the challenge of remodeling our societies so as to achieve a just or sustainable distribution of the resulting wealth. Instead, today we see increasing global disparities in wealth and a technology-driven polarization of the labor market. Daniel Markovits portrays America as increasingly polarized between a few glossy jobs, nice ones, and a majority of gloomy ones. Asia has participated in this trend with large-scale outsourcing of mostly gloomy jobs from the West to Asian countries with cheaper labor costs. This has brought significant poverty alleviation and social mobility for many across Asia. But further automation of production will likely lead to redundancy for many workers in Asia as in the West. Meanwhile, a narrow cadre of highly educated elites corners the market for increasingly specialized, superordinate roles in sectors such as finance, management, the law, and technology itself. The consequences of all this involve more than just spiraling inequality. A narrowly instrumentalist vision of education as human capital generation negates values intrinsic to the fulfilling life. Lewis Mumford eloquently summarized what this means. Life requires for its fulfillment goods and services that are usually placed in the department of luxuries, he wrote. Song, story, music, painting, carving, idle play, drama are functions which must be included in human existence, even to satisfy the belly, to say nothing of the emotional and intellectual and imaginative needs of man. To put these functions at a distance, to make them the goal of an acquisitive life, or to accept only so much of them as can be canalized into machine goods and sold at a profit. To do this is to misinterpret the nature of life as well as the possibilities of the machine. What we see today, though, is precisely this kind of canalization or commodification. Occupations whose outputs cannot readily be monetized are increasingly devalued, and leisure itself is stigmatized. And this is happening even as technology restricts opportunities for intrinsically meaningful work to an ever smaller minority. Rather than prompting a reconsideration of the instrumentalist human capital orientation in education, the COVID-19 crisis has actually led many governments across the world to double down. In Australia, for example, reforms were announced in June 2020 that proposed lowering fees for university courses that were considered job relevant, while raising costs for some humanities courses. The British government has also intensified a push towards vocational training while reducing funding for arts and music courses at universities. It has also sought to ban the use in schools of material it deems anti-capitalist. This is in Britain. These recent Western moves echo long-standing practice across much of Asia. So in other words, in some respects, Western states now can be seen as catching up with position occupied by many of their Asian counterparts when it comes to this intensive, very narrow human capital orientation in education. East Asian regimes have long adopted a strongly instrumental focus on STEM and a highly statist vision of education's purposes. Japan has recently intensified a STEM bias in its public universities to the detriment of the social sciences and humanities. Elsewhere in Asia, the link between educational instrumentalism and political authoritarianism is stark. In China, the principle of scientific development is invoked to legitimate communist dictatorship. And this echoes the points made that I quoted earlier, made by Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. In India, touted as the world's largest democracy, we also see an increasingly authoritarian regime fetishizing science and technology. A new national education policy issued by the Indian government in 2020 was criticized as a deadly cocktail of the Hindutva agenda and the World Bank model of knowledge, designed to serve corporate job markets. That policy's emphasis on technology, expanded private provision, and vocational training for the masses was seen as a recipe for intensifying educational inequality and stratification in India. Now, in India, the COVID crisis has provided the backdrop for reforms to education policy that promise to exacerbate meritocracy-fueled inequality in a society where inequality is already worsening as a direct consequence of the pandemic. The Indian formula differs significantly from China's in the extent of its embrace of the market. However, in its statism, instrumentalism, and faith in science and technology, the NEP strongly echoes East Asian precedents. Similarly, the emphasis on duty and discipline over rights and freedoms, backed up by appeals to supposedly unique national traditions in India, mirrors China's authoritarian nationalism. The second category of challenges identified in our 2017 report of nationalism and weak regionalism is closely associated with a vision of citizens as human capital. To see an individual as a human resource means taking her not as an end in herself, but as a tool for fulfillment of goals imposed on her by others. Highlighting the connection between nationalism and instrumentalism does not mean that patriotism or a shared identity are bad things in themselves. Indeed, the COVID crisis has underlined the importance to societies of a shared sense of identity and values. The comparative success of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan in coordinating responses to the pandemic without stringent lockdowns is explained partly by a strong sense of mutual regard and shared identity in these societies. China's successful campaign to contain the virus was also conducted under the banner of patriotism, but China has relied less on shared values than on draconian surveillance and enforcement. China under COVID has truly recalled Arendt's description of totalitarianism as organized loneliness. The value of patriotism in a moment of national crisis should not obscure the dangers of chauvinism and xenophobia. Across the world, COVID has stoked these dangerous passions. China, for example, quickly sought to present COVID-19 as a win for one-party autocracy, with President Xi Jinping declaring that the pandemic once again proves the supremacy of the socialist system with Chinese characteristics. Elsewhere too, framing pandemic responses as some sort of international competition has injected further bitterness into global diplomacy, threatening efforts to achieve transnational collaboration over other shared threats, such as climate change. Within nations too, the pandemic has fueled tension. In 2020, a UN Special Rapporteur lamented the scapegoating of minorities, as well as a deteriorating outlook for migrants and refugees. Here again, education's role in propagating totalizing visions of national identity, often based on distorted narratives of historical victimhood, stokes intercommunal tensions. In both India and China, the brunt of stringent coronavirus lockdowns was borne by rural migrants to cities. And in both countries, 2020 saw the ramping up of ongoing campaigns to suppress ethnic and religious minorities and to clamp down on political opposition. China's government was already engaged in a sweeping project of incarceration and re-education directed at the Muslim Uyghurs of Xinjiang. During 2020, this was further extended, signifying total abandonment of the Communist Party's supposedly multi-ethnic plural vision of Chineseness. Meanwhile, at the southern end of China, the early months of the pandemic coincided with a fierce crackdown in Hong Kong, involving stringent new controls on education. The national security law introduced in June 2020, includes restrictions on free speech within local classrooms and in the media, all justified with reference to the supposed threat of foreign forces. In India, the BJP government has also taken further steps to promote its Hindu nationalist agenda through education. The new education policy, promulgated in July 2020, emphasizes the importance of teaching Sanskrit, an ancient language like Latin, no longer used in daily life, but the importance of teaching Sanskrit at all levels of the education system, but makes no mention of Urdu, the language of high culture for South Asian Muslims. Japanese, Korean, and Thai are named as foreign languages to be taught in India's schools, but not Chinese. The document is suffused with glowing references to India's distant past, but lacks any reference to the medieval period when Muslim kingdoms ruled northern India. Nationalism, long propagated and reinforced through education, has thus both conditioned responses to the pandemic across much of Asia and derived a further boost from the pandemic. In fact, perhaps the prime example of xenophobia in action relates to the strict closure of borders across East Asia, which is better explained by nationalist policies, I think, than by medical necessity. The upsurge of chauvinism during the COVID crisis does not suggest that education systems are likely to help promote the consciousness of our shared humanity that we need for concerted global action, for example, to combat climate change. A shared sense of identity and civic purpose is necessary in modern societies, but it can also become a tool for narrowing our search for fulfillment and channeling it in directions ordained by powerful elites. In the early 20th century, many Western observers linked Europe's drift into the Great War to the phenomenon of social regimentation. Lewis Mumford argued that regimentation was the soil in which the machine could grow. He linked mechanization and regimentation to the quantification of life and concentration on power as an end in itself. This amounted, he wrote, to a growing contempt for life in its variety, its individuality, its natural insurgence and exuberance. In our 2017 report, we took a similarly grim view of the relationship between education, regimentation, and competitiveness across Asia. But were we wrong? The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted advantages enjoyed by relatively orderly, disciplined societies where citizens are more likely to obediently follow guidelines over social distancing and mask wearing. And an emphasis on regimentation can be seen in part as signifying a proper recognition of the socializing function of schooling. For example, Japan's relatively short school closures during 2020 and its reluctance to experiment with online learning, I think, reflect an understanding of the importance of schooling's socializing function, which has been absent in societies like Britain or America, for example. But socialization in Japan does also mean regimentation. Japanese regimentation means subjecting the working population to a regime of absurdly long hours, exemplifying the contempt for life Mumford associates with the machine age. This is a malign outcome of an entrenched insistence on individual subordination to collective or corporate goals. That insistence is in some respects even more pronounced in China. There, the combination of elitist meritocracy and strict regimentation with military overtones actually reminds us of imperial Japan, so pre-war Japan rather than post-war Japan. But when it comes to achieving social control, the Chinese authorities place less faith in the power of socialization, relying on extensive and intrusive surveillance. The Chinese government has recently taken decisive steps to clamp down on private tutoring with the declared aim of diminishing the burden on students and relieving educational intensity. But these measures won't solve the fundamental problem of competitive intensity and inequality in China. The demand for private tutoring in China, as elsewhere, is driven by credentialism. Competition for credentials is in turn fueled by the consequences for individuals and families of success or failure in the race for qualifications. As in any arms race, the contestants constantly seek to take the struggle into fresh territory. So shutting tutorial schools or regulating technology may alter the forms that competition takes, but it won't alter the competitive dynamic itself. What powers that dynamic? What is the ultimate driving force behind intensifying educational competition is insecurity. Insecurity weaves competitiveness and regimentation into a matrix of socio-political control, especially in systems where assessment focuses on mastery of a narrow and uniform curriculum. Examinations test an individual's willingness and ability to conform. Sometimes, as in China, this imperative is manifested in rhetoric portraying educational competition as a collective duty and students as loyal soldiers preparing for the examination battle. Insecurity also powerfully influences competitive nationalisms. A vision of international competition as a Darwinian struggle for the survival of the fittest reinforces an instrumentalist conception of education's role. In this respect, the sort of language used by the OECD and by nationalist ideologues is strikingly similar. As one Chinese textbook puts it, invoking the 19th century Opium Wars, not studying leads to backwardness, and backwardness leads to getting beaten. Many states today seek to promote the idea that a disciplined focus on the competition to enhance one's own human capital is a patriotic imperative. But the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the unsustainability of educational regimes that demand regimented diligence from students, but cannot deliver broadly shared security and dignity in return. Meritocracy, at the best of times, is riddled with injustice, but when inequality is turbocharged by mass school closures and labor market disruption blights the life chances of young people, the illusion of fairness wears very thin. Technical adjustments to educational delivery cannot on their own bring about social justice and will do nothing to moderate the fierce competitive intensity that distorts our lives. For that, we need to look beyond schooling itself to the social, political, and cultural contexts in which it is embedded. I'm currently involved in a new UNESCO project that aims to review the state of education globally and explain how it can contribute to human flourishing. But I feel that many of these overambitious international reports make the mistake of seeing education as the master tool for remaking society. In fact, rethinking schooling is never enough. We must also rethink the socio-economic models that drive the intensive competitiveness of our education systems. Of course, we cannot entirely eliminate competition from our societies, and we wouldn't want to, but we must recognize the dehumanizing consequences of excessive competitive intensity. Our ingrained habit of treating fellow citizens as bundles of skills to be evaluated for their productive capacity is perverse and degrading. It punishes misfortune, it stokes elitism, and incentivizes unsustainable economic behavior. So I think Thomas Piketty is right when he proposes a multi-pronged approach to addressing the curse of inequality in today's world. Debating education apart from its socio-economic and political context is pointless. We cannot take the poison of competitive intensity out of our education systems without undertaking a larger project of societal transformation. Piketty argues that this will require, amongst other things, a major shift towards progressive taxation involving transnational collaboration, state-coordinated measures to redistribute wealth, some form of land reform, and a means of taxing carbon emissions. We may disagree over the details, but if we want to realize a vision of learning as intrinsically fulfilling as part of what it means to live a good life, then we need to think more in terms of transforming society in order to transform education, not just the other way around. Thank you.
跟各位致意的是因为这是没有 Q&A 的一个过程。不过Professor Vicks 一直在叫我们在做一个 rethinking 哈。那事实上刚才跟各位分享，就是说做一个人不一定是教育人，本来就应该要有这种反思跟思辨的能力。那这里面他举了一些国家做例子，但是我总觉得他是在东亚跟南亚，比如说日本中国跟印度，那么也谈到这个一开始也提到澳洲跟英国的一个对教育的一个价值跟定义的追求事实上是有区别的。我如果用很浅薄的，因为我个人对国际比较教育也有兴趣。那 Professor Vicks 他有很好的一个历练，就是他在2003年到2012年的时候，他是在伦敦的 IOE， 不过现在好像改成 UCL， 就是好像在那边担任讲座担任那个教授的一个在比较教育的这样的一个学程里面来担任讲授者。那这个丰富他对国际比较教育的观察，那本身他又学历史的，我觉得都有助于他提供很多思辨的方向。但是我跟各位讲，就是说，在人力资本的国家目的，还是所谓的这个个人自我实现、充分发展，在这个摆荡当中，我不敢说我这样的见解是对的，但是各位可以去思考一下。事实上还有第三条路，就是北欧这几年一直在追求的，以公民素养作为他们教育的总目标。也因为用公民素养作为他们教育总目标，所以他们在课程的设计上，是会比较偏向于批判思考、思辨能力，然后反省、参与、行动这样的一个该有的公民素养或所谓的民主素养。那这个基本上不谈国家认同，但他已经有国家认同。他不谈这个个人充分实现，可是他就会有一种个人自我实现的一个意涵在里头。那当然，这是我个人很浅薄的看法。也许各位可以看一下瑞典这几年的教育发展，或者芬兰这几年的教育发展，那对照我们 Professor Vicks 今天的这个主题演讲，那做一个参照。那以上很简单的提供给各位做思考啊，谢谢各位今天的参与，不管是在座或线上的伙伴们，谢谢。
第3场主题演讲到此结束，接下来是午餐时间，各位来宾可移驾至用餐教室享用午餐。下午的场次将于下午1点30分开始，请各位来宾再由线上进入各会场。我们有更多的议题，欢迎大家踊跃参与，谢谢您的合作。另外，明天早上11点将举办本次研讨会第4场主题演讲，一样将由 YouTube 线上直播。我们明天见。